Ye Watchers, Ye Holy Ones by Rafaela Ramos, read by Rafaela Ramos. Chapter 4. All Ye Who Enter Here. He knew that the universe had changed when you could move without a wave of pain slamming him down. Instead of a formless void of darkness and despair, a ground of soil and leaves crunched underneath him as he sat up and regarded his newly formed surroundings. He was in a forest. It was either pre-dawn or dusk. The low light cast everything in shades of gray, including the skin of his body. It was the body of a healthy 40-something-year-old man. He wasn't surprised that he had a body, and that the body was as naked and clean as the day of Adam's creation. After everything that had happened to him in his long existence, nothing surprised him. Trapped in this human's inner universe, he wondered if he could give himself clothes. He looked down and saw his body clothed in a solid black t-shirt, simple blue jeans, and white and black sneakers. He could feel clean underwear, boxers, not briefs, and thick athletic socks underneath the ensemble. He touched his head and face, hair cropped short, face clean-shaven. All the injured creature comforts, he wryly commented, and then noticed his voice seemed to be swallowed by the trees. No wind, no animal sounds. When he stood up and took a step forward, the only sound he heard was crunching leaves, muffled by the close-growing trees, their branches high and intertwined in a thick canopy. He reached out and touched the trunk of one of the trees. Ah! He jerked his hand back after feeling the uncanny warm thrum of a heartbeat. He flexed his fingers and gave his hand a quick shake. Been humans too long, he thought derisively, chiding himself. Hello? He looked sharply to his right. From the gray gloom he saw a woman emerge, her feet crunching the dead leaves underfoot. He stared at her, slight build, 30-something, olive skin, brown hair, blue eyes, and wondered what odd phantasm she represented, created from the madness of his human host. Are you real? She asked. He was taken aback. This wasn't the expected response from a figment of a homeless man's imagination. Yes. Are you? In answer, she stepped forward, paused, and then touched his arm. Miranda, he thought. Jamie, she thought. The transfer of thought was instantaneous, involuntary, and electric. He violently drew back his arm as it burned. The woman's blue eyes widened. You're him. What? The fallen angel. This time his whole body started and he became a friend. Who are you? He demanded. How do you know who I am? The woman sat down, placing her forehead in her arms, in her hands. This is impossible, absolutely impossible. But the pieces fit. They fit, she rambled. Being ignored, he found himself becoming more angry than fearful. He squatted in front of her. Answer me, who are you? She looked up. I refuse to believe that I'm going mad, so I'm going to accept this reality as it is because Jamie needs me. What are you talking about? He couldn't help yelling. She moved to push him back, but he voluntarily moved out of her way, wary of her touch. Jamie is my brother, the human you've been possessing. She stared at him. I've been dreaming about your memories. I see now they're your memories for the past 5 years. I didn't even know angels had personal memories, except until I saw yours. Loving Miranda, who betrayed you. Living in crazy, harmless people. She noted his look of shock. I thought all fallen angels were demons, but you're like a human, something in between. It was strange to hear about himself with such clarity from this woman. His gaze studied her, trying to see the light of heaven in her, but he couldn't tell. He had been more human than angel for far too long. What are you, prophet? Saint? Preacher? She shook her head. I'm no saint. I'm just an English professor. So how? Do you know something about your host when you possess them? Zoe interrupted. Do you have access to their memories? He shook his head impatiently. I could. I choose not to, as their memories are often shattered by their madness. It served no purpose for me to know. But, so you don't know anything about my brother? What? No. He was unique. He had already encapsulated himself when I arrived, already locked away his memories and his soul, as if he were expecting something like me. But the woman placed her forehead in her hands again. What? He demanded, irritated. My brother can see something like you. Perhaps not all of you, she waved a hand at him, but he could see the dark, invisible things, human or otherwise, ever since we were children. He stared at her and then shrugged at the information. What would he do? Keep a low profile. Stay safe. He'd always try to warn me, but I never believed him, she said, her voice stricken with guilt at the end. So you didn't have this ability? No. He would be considered a prophet, a holy man in the early times, as opposed to a paranoid schizophrenic in modern times? He looked around him impatiently. You haven't answered my question. So how do I know you? She looked at him. I don't know. Jamie could never show what he could see, but with you and him, I don't know. He has spirit energy to send? And with Jamie encapsulated, as you say, what he sent to me weren't his perceptions, but yours. He scowled. That's obscene. Like standing naked in front of a mirror, not knowing it was a two-way mirror. He closed his eyes, crossing his arms deep into the scowl. You know everything about me. Zoe. What? He opened his eyes. My name is Zoe. As in life. Yes. He stared at her and then peered quizzically at the canopy-obscured imaginary sky, as if looking for an answer. He's dying, as you likely know, your brother. He's dying, but his soul won't let go. He's not encapsulated anymore, or this forest wouldn't be here. His soul won't let go, and it won't let me go. I don't know why. It has something to do with you, I'm certain. That's why you're here. Why am I here? My best guess? To help him die. She breathed deeply. She looked up at him with deep, piercing eyes and then pushed herself up, standing about a foot away from him. Okay, that sounds right. She clasped her arms around herself as if suddenly chilled. I may not know everything about you. I may know everything about you, but at least you know my name. What's yours? He frowned at the question and took a long time to answer. Call me Ed. Like Moby Dick? That your real name? Astute this one is. That was unnecessarily rude. Zoe scanned for an opening through the forest. I assume you're coming with me? Better than sitting around here waiting for your brother to die. Zoe ignored the callous tone of Ed's reply, as it reminded her of an important concern. Am I really in Jamie? Or am I really outside, next to Jamie's hospital bed, and I'm dreaming all this? Ed shrugged. God only knows. Let's move. They weren't certain that the forest did or did not go on forever until they felt the ground underneath them start to slope downwards in a gentle incline. The trees thinned out onto long stretches of clay and sand riverbank, which drops steeply into a wide, fast-moving river, undulating as if filled with gray, silver-tinged fish. Zoe drew closer to the river, but then suddenly drew back. The river wasn't a river of fish-filled water. The river was a river of people. Men, women, children, different ages, different ethnicities, but the gloom cast a universal silvery gray to their color, and their eyes never wavered. They looked forward as they whipped past the riverbank, a river rapid of single-minded people, as impersonal and untouchable as strangers in an overcrowded elevator. On the other side of the river, at a distance, rose high, neon-lit buildings of a city. Zoe glanced at Ed. Can you fly? He hunched his shoulders. No. Why? If I knew that, don't you think I'd figure out a way and would already be flying instead of walking? He responded, peevish. He looked at the swift current of people before him. He stooped down, picked up a large rock, and threw it into the middle of the river. Hey, look! Like water, the current of people split before the rock hit and then converged back when the rock hit the bottom. Have you ever walked in a crowded sidewalk? You're busy. You have 1,000 items on your to-do list. You're on an autopilot. So are the hundreds of people around you. What do you do if there's an obstacle in your way? A big rock, a lost tourist, a homeless person. You go around it without missing a step. Ed hopped off the bank and strode through the river of people, leaving a tiny liminal space in his wake. Zoe followed in his wake, amazed as the unseen people swiftly parted and then converged around her without anyone ever touching her, like negative polarity magnets, repelling each other. The riverbed was wide, and Zoe took careful, deliberate steps. All she heard was her heartbeat, her breath, and the low cacophony of muted footsteps rising like a hum from the riverbed. The gloom from the forest extended over here, and she couldn't distinguish one from another in her slow crossing. On the other side, Ed stood, waiting on the riverbank. He didn't help her up and watched as she scrambled out of the riverbed and stood up, smoothing down her denim shirt and tan capri pants. They looked at the silent human river, a packed mass of lonely people. Acheron, Zoe suddenly stated, her eyes widening to recognition. What? That, she nodded toward the riverbed, is my brother's version of Acheron. Filled not with water, but the uncommitted. Ed stared at the rushing people and then the city rising out of the gloom in the near distance. Dante's Inferno? Jamie's Inferno, Zoe corrected. She shook her head in disbelief. But inverted. Aren't we supposed to go down in hell? Ed snorted. You don't have to be in a steep, dark hole to be in hell. He looked at the city, built high on a hill, with an imposing office tower of staggered steel and mirrors eerily lit with red neon tubing as the highest structure in its epicenter. "You talk too much." He strode onward. Zoe replied, following. "You—" She stopped speaking as she stepped off from the incline of the riverbank to the flat plain before her, which sat at the bottom of the high hill of the city. The plain was filled with little cardboard shanties, and in front of each cluster of shanties was a low fire and little metal trash bins. Clustered around each fire stood or sat people dressed in tattered clothes, some in layers, some hardly wearing anything at all. But what stopped Zoe's voice was a vision of little children, dotted here and there in that narrow plain, wandering around the fire to fire, crying out, "Daddy? Mommy? Where are you?" Zoe hadn't realized she had stopped walking until she saw Ed's hunched, rushed form 100 yards into that shanty town. She jogged to catch up, feeling smothered by the stifling heat of those fires and those huddled people, their backs turned against her and those little children. "Shouldn't we help them?" she asked as soon as she reached Ed. "Who?" He glanced down. "They're not real, you know. Just figments of your brother's imagination mixed with memories of events long dead." He strode forward again, but then realized that Zoe wasn't following when he glanced back and saw her kneeling before one of the little images, which looked like a little boy. "Oh, come on!" He sighed in exasperation. He backtracked to her location in time to see her hold the little boy's hand and start walking from fire to fire. "What are you doing?" he demanded, walking beside her. "I don't care if they're just synapses firing in Jamie's brain. Here they're people, and they feel, and this little boy's lost. I'm helping him find his daddy." "You can help everyone," Ed pointed out, impatient. "Well, I'm at least helping this one." Ed sighed but waited. He saw Zoe do what the wandering children and the fire-huddling adults did not do, which was catch their attention and look into their eyes, talking to them. The adults looked as if woken from a daze, and when Zoe didn't find the boy's father there, she moved on to the next fire. But then Ed stood amazed, as those adults didn't return to gazing at the fire, but began talking to each other and then talking to the children. When Zoe finally reunited the boy with his father, that was not the only reunion, as the adults continued Zoe's action, fighting lost parents for those lost children. When Zoe returned to Ed, she left behind a wake of reunited families, holding each other close and tight, almost afraid to let go. "What's the point of that?" Ed asked. "We're still stuck here, trapped in this plane. What's the use?" She shook her head at his question. "Even people in cages need love, too." She continued forward, leaving Ed, who stared at her for a moment, but then followed. They hiked up a steep, thin ridge, finding that it was a levee wall as another narrow plain was on the other side. But this plain was filled with run-down buildings, a jumbled urban mix of warehouses, motels, and burglar bar storefronts, the streetlights barely illuminating the cracked sidewalks and empty pothole-strewn streets. Initially surveying the plain, Zoe and Ed thought the buildings and streets were arranged at random, but the more they looked, the more they found it fit a particular pattern. "It's a maze," Ed declared. "Yes." Zoe traced the various routes with her finger, following all the dead ends. The last route she traced led to one particular place. "We need to go there," she pointed, a warehouse building luridly lit on the other side of the plain, nestled against the foot of the hill of skyscrapers. Ed looked at the building, seeing the garish light pulsing as if to a heavy beat, even though everything was silent. "A dance club? Your brother's vision of hell has a dance club?" She shrugged and then scrambled down the levee wall, with Ed following after. They emerged from a high border of evergreen bushes to a narrow alleyway slick with water. They walked, turning left, then right, and then left again, following their mental map of the route to the club. However, they soon reached a dead end, where another passageway should be. Backtracking, they arrived at a different point from where they should have been. "It's like the routes are changing," Zoe explained, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. "It's because they are." Ed held out his arm, stopping Zoe without touching her, like a crosswalk guard. This time, looking where they had been, Zoe saw the passageway obscured by fog, and then clear with a totally different street, going left instead of right. She groaned in frustration. "How—" "Wait." They stood still, as immobile as the concrete walls and the lonely streetlights. At first, Zoe strained to see and hear something, anything, but then she pulled in her senses, hearing the blood rush in her ears like waves crashing in an undertow. Then she heard her heart beat. Thump, 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 until she could feel her heartbeat pressing hard against her sternum. Boom, 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 boom. and then she heard it, outside of and all around herself. "We're here," Ed said, his voice loud and close to her ear. So I wondered why he had to be so loud, but the heavy beat of the house music and the sweaty claustrophobic pressure of writhing bodies answered her. They were in the middle of the club's dance floor. "Ed!" Zoe started to say, but the jostling mass of dancing bodies pushed her away from Ed so she couldn't see him. Panic, she glanced up, seeing a gaudy disco ball spinning and reflecting crazily the roving spotlights of red, which were the only illumination in the entire place. She saw no ceiling, obscured by the inky darkness where there were no spotlights. On high pillars staggered around the perimeter of the dance floor were tall, narrow cages, with one barely clothed, painfully thin woman writhing upright in each one. Each cage dancer glowed eerily, with the two steady spotlights pointed upwards from the bottom of each pillar. "Ed!" she called out, trying to push her way towards the direction where she last saw him. It was like pushing against a windstorm, albeit a storm stinking of sweat, musk, and sex pheromones. Hands groping for bodies whipped around her as she pushed forward, but even in her alarm she noticed that the hands were not for her but for each other, as mindful of her as ants were the lamp post. The red lights cast everything and everybody with that eerie red glow, as if the entire club was inflamed and sick. While the music and dancing feet were deafening, the people themselves were silent, as mute as the one-sided people of the river Acheron. "Jamesy boy!" exclaimed a high girl's friend. "Time for a drink!" As much as a person in a windstorm could whip around, Zoe did so as a voice was behind her. She saw one of the dazed cage dancers jump down from her pillar, disappearing from her line of sight. More forcefully, she elbowed her way through, emerging against a low metal rail that was part of the boundary enclosing the dance floor like a human pen. On the other side of the rail was a narrow strip of level floor, and then a few but steep series of steps leading to an open-faced mezzanine where a long, smoky bar ran along the entire length of the wall. The wall behind the bar was filled to the ceiling with bottles of spirits of every kind imaginable, displayed like graven images in shelves lit with the same black-lit red. Every bar stool was occupied, mostly with people whose backs were turned away from the crowded dance floor, focused in their task of getting drunk. On two bar stools in the middle of the bar sat the dancer, evidently on a break, and a young Jamie Fitzpatrick. "Jamie!" Zoe cried out, clambering over the rail. He looked not much older than the 18-year-old Jamie of Zoe's 20-year-old memory, sitting in that familiar defensive hunched-over way he would sit, an outsider looking in, unsure whether to scowl or frown. Once at the bar, she reached out to touch his shoulder, but her hand passed right through him, as if he were air, and it landed with a hard smack against the bar counter. "What the—" "He's a memory," Zoe heard behind her, as she looked up and around, seeing Ed standing with a similar hunched shoulder stance. "The club is an amalgam of memories and impressions made into concrete form, but what you're seeing now is based on an actual memory of a once upon a time. He's as tangible as an image on a screen." Zoe pulled her hand back through the Jamie memory, and stood back, unsure what next to do. "Jamesy, come on, don't be such a party pooper," the dancer said, pushing a shot glass of an amber liquid with one small hand while raising another to her candy red lips. She whipped back her white blonde waist-length hair and then slammed down the empty shot glass on the counter. "Another one, Mando, and the next round for everyone on me." Her generous offer solicited a uniform response of cheers from the drinkers at the bar, but Jamie was undeterred, leaving his shot glass untouched. "Lexa, please listen to me." He placed his hands on the dancer's thin, bare shoulders and forced her to look at him, his dark eyes trying to connect with the watery, bloodshot blue ones, which were almost obscured by her heavy, dark makeup. For a heartbeat or two, she stared back, but then she laughed and shook off his hands. "You're always so serious. Can't you have fun? I want to have fun, Jamesy." Zoe had been looking at Jamie, but then she shifted her full attention to the dancer. She gave a silent gasp as she finally saw her, a pale, skeletal girl who couldn't be any older than 16. "Lexa," Jamie said. "This guy bothering you, babe?" A large man, a man of muscle and power, emerged from the shadows and draped a possessing arm around Lexa's bird-like shoulders. "No, TK, no," she laughed with that high, girlish voice that belied the fear in her two wide blue eyes. "Lexa," Jamie said, as if the man wasn't even there. "Hey, when you talk to me." The man exploded, reaching for something in his jacket with his free hand. "No!" Lexa screamed. "No!" Zoe cried out, throwing herself forward, unable to stop the past of 20 years ago, as a young girl threw herself between the man who owned her and the boy who loved her, taking the full brunt of the .45 caliber round that had sat ready in its chamber. The gunshot drowned out the hypnotic dance music, drowned out Zoe's screams, until its echo resolved itself into a steady but fast heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. And Zoe could see again. The club was behind them, silent and dark. Get up. The club behind Ed lay at the bottom of a bridge, a thick fog enveloping it and its surrounding warehouse district. Before him stretched a lonely wide bridge of asphalt and concrete, leading straight into the downtown of a dark city. He was impatient, wanting to cross that bridge, and frowned at the kneeling form next to him, which shook with every silent sob. Get up, he repeated. It's just an old memory. No point crying about it. He heard the sickening sound of mucus being sucked in, of Zoe wiping her eyes on her short sleeves. Then he heard her stand up. Would it all be like that? She asked. Ed glanced back at where the club was and then returned to peer down the curving length of the bridge, his eyes tracing a too familiar snaky billow of dark smoke rising from the other side. No, he replied. It will be worse.